Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the History of Fresh Produce. I'm Maddie Fisher, and on today's episode, we are going to take you on a journey through a chapter of American agriculture that's often been left off the table. Today, we're diving into the story of America's forgotten farmers, the African American farmers who played a huge role in shaping the U.S. agriculture landscape. Millions of enslaved Africans brought their farming skills to the Americas, laying the groundwork for the crop and produce that we rely on today. Fast forward to today, African American farmers are still making waves in agriculture, but the numbers have dropped drastically. So what happened? And how are they shaping the fresh produce world now? Well, to break it all down, we've got the guys who know how to serve up we've got the guys who know how to serve up history with a fresh twist. Patrick Kelly, John Papp, and their surprise special guest. Take it away, fellas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie.
I did a twist on the history of fresh produce, and it just got me all tongue-tied.
It was because it was a twist.
But I had to pause it because I know, this will be a podcast later, and you can just edit that. Nobody is gonna see it.
Nobody's gonna know.
Nobody's gonna.
The beauty of live podcasting.
I like live, anyways. All right,
real.
All right, let's get into it.
Thank you, Maddie.
So, hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is our second live stream of the year of 2025, and we're going to dive into this quickly because we are a little bit late, but that's what happens. But to give all of you a little state of play here, you will have heard at this point our episode on the transatlantic slave trade, as well as our two-part series on George Washington Carver. If you haven't listened to those episodes, definitely go back and listen to them. Really going to make today's conversation even more relevant. Obviously, don't stop listening now. You can go back later and listen after the fact. And then what's coming up next week, we have a bonus episode to all of our club members, which is going to be, of course, focused on Black history, with it still being Black History Month. Special guests are going to be joining us for that one. And actually, as a gift to all of you non-members, we are going to make that available to all of you. So
100%.
You're welcome and enjoy it. And then the week after that, we will have an episode on Russia, Ukraine, and the role that produce is playing in that conflict, which is even more pertinent given all the news cycle in the last few days.
Agreed.
Patrick, without any further ado, we're going to get into today's topic, which Maddie kind of alluded to. It's really talking about a lot of things that we've been building up to, honestly, in these last few episodes. It's the African American farmer, the huge contributions that this group of people have made to this industry, specifically in America, as you will have heard through those last three episodes. But one thing, Patrick, and you and I saw is why don't we see more African American farmers in our space today? What happened? And honestly, there's a story behind that, just like there is a story behind everything. And a rich history and and causation for why we are in a position that we are today with what we see. And again, because we are not necessarily experts in that, we wanted to do this justice. So we reached out to an amazing person who were gracious enough, accepted to join us on today's live stream. This is going to be the first time we've had a guest on a live stream episode, so it's extra special.
So bear with us; we're learning as well through this process.
Yes, and so our guest today, he's an African American culinary historian, an educator, an author of The Cooking Gene, who won 2 times James Beard Book Award winner. He is also the National Jewish Book Award winner for his 2022 book, The Kosher Soul. He's a revolutionary resident at Colonial Williamsburg. And if that wasn't enough, he also featured on Netflix's award-winning series, High on the Hog, which we obviously, again, cannot recommend highly enough.
Amazing. It was amazing.
And that person is Mr. Michael Chwitty. So welcome to the History of Fresh Produce, Michael.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. We're very excited to have this conversation. And yeah, to hear your knowledge on this topic, because it's obviously a topic of very rich history. And so we'll just dive into it. So listeners would have heard when we started, well, when we ended with the transatlantic slave trade, is that the enslaved Africans were on these plantations. Obviously, the Civil War broke out, and then we kind of left off with the Civil War ending. And when the Civil War did end, obviously we entered a period of Reconstruction. And while on paper, the enslaved Africans started to gain their freedom, there were challenges, obviously, that affected Black farmers and their ability to own land. So can you paint us a picture of what that scene looked like post-Civil War for the African American farmer and their role on the land?
I think people need to understand that our history and our story was always colloquial and discretionary. A large majority of our people needed to be integrated into citizenry. And the power, I'll just put it this way, the power of that conversation is affecting us right now. Because, our citizenship was the first thing called into question. But here's the deal. Formerly enslaved African Americans came in several different groups. One were free people of color, some of whom had access to property and land. There were Black farmers and Black homesteaders all over America. One of the most famous Black rural villages, Seneca Village, is now what we call Central Park. And that's not a pleasant history. I mean, it's not, let me just put it this way. It's not a pleasant history because it's about, making something out of nothing and having it often be usurped by the law or the white community. And I have to give you that, a lot of people, I have to say this, a lot of people, say, okay, that's so great, but what happened to y'all? And it's not because of lack of industry or lack of ambition,
right,
or desire to be part of, a country where, agricultural productivity was the main, sign that you had, you were doing something with your life and you had made it. And we came from thousands of years of an agrarian tradition, men and women. And so there's all these different pieces that we have to look at. Some people did not want to go anywhere. They wanted to stay right where they were. They wanted their 40 acres and a mule, which was promised to us by the man for whom my university, Howard University, was named, General Otis Howard. Some people got on the way to that, and then it was quashed. Andrew Johnson was like, nah, I can't do my fellow white Southerners that way. Even though the text of this kind of conversation was, you guys have worked so hard for 400 years. Now it's time to reward you with a piece of the American dream. And then it was taken from them. And other people bought the land, which some people may think that's noble. I don't. I think I have my own opinions on that, But the bottom line is that for some time, enslaved Africans were giving of their knowledge to the people who were around them. So I think some people had the narrative of, well, they were given an agricultural path. No, our ancestors came here knowing how to grow corn, rice, tobacco, cotton, indigo. Indigo, the experience was thousands of years. Tobacco, like before John Rolfe ever thought to use tobacco as a cash crop. It's already being grown in West Africa en masse. So those people knew how to grow that tobacco before they came here. Cotton, even longer, 3,000, 4,000 years. So that's the first part. The second part is that produce and vegetables and crops were used to in bartering and also to economically stake a claim before enslavement. And therefore, after it, we were the general, local produce merchants, along with the Germans and several other ethnic minorities, particularly in places like Washington, D.C. and Baltimore and Richmond, Virginia, Savannah, Charleston, New Orleans, Memphis, Nashville, all these big cities that, the South had to its name, which weren't that big by Northern standards, but were significant to, the former Confederacy. We were the people selling the stuff to the, workers and servants and this and that and housewives. And it was called truck farming, right? And truck farming, mentioned by Frederick Douglass and others, was the means by which many enslaved people were able to have some actual, liquid capital in their hands, buy the freedom of their family members, particularly if they were older or younger, not prime, in other words. So that's often the case. Alexandria, we have a case of a woman who bought her older husband's freedom with tomatoes. Now you might go, that's nice, but the fact of the matter is, if he was an older man in the 1800s in slavery, older, we're talking about 50 or above, and by that time, most Black men in the early to mid 1800s were beyond use. You get my meaning. They were pretty much worked to the point where arthritis, heart disease, other things that we know about now would have been so of course you can buy her 50-plus-year-old husband with some tomatoes, because no longer a prime worker, especially if his body had shown signs of overwork age. So all of that's important to the society. Also, we couldn't depend on anybody else for food. So we had to know how to grow our own. I came into that culture in the 70s and 80s. So this is a long and enduring part of our heritage, is you had to know how to grow your own garden, how to raise your own medicinals, all that stuff was on you. And there wasn't just one garden. There might be a garden in the woods. It might be a garden in off property. It might be a garden right where you lived, and you did a lot of sharing with the people around you. Even in Washington, D.C., my birthplace, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, there was a network of, what do we call it now? Not just bartering, but care for each other, like mutual aid. So, there wasn't enough food. Your relatives, your family, even in the city, were growing enough so that we could cover those spaces. Yep. So we really have to talk about all of those different elements, the social elements, in addition to what was actually being done. It's important time to take a moment to say this as well. The sale of these vegetables and the sale of the produce was very aesthetically pleasing. one of the things that's most frequently recorded in writing and then later by audio are the calls of these men and women as they sell their strawberries and their okra and other things. And there are these beautiful paintings from that time period, which for most people looks just like still lives. Okay, that's great. When you're little and you learn how to make a still life, you think, okay, oranges and apple, that's nonsense. It's just like, okay, how realistic? The teacher's like, how realistic can you make this orange look? And it's so dumb because it's totally counterintuitive to what the great, post-impressionists and others were trying to do, which is have the creativity of a child. But I digress. Those paintings show us something amazing, which is you don't have a Polaroid, shows my age. You don't have a snapshot, a screenshot of what life was like in 1890. Pictures were expensive. Any images we can capture quickly and sufficiently is expensive. So what did you have? You had paintings that showed how the black market women. You have other images that are clearly from plantations, farms of produce grown by Black people. And you have images of these, colorful figures who were selling food in cities like Philadelphia and New York as well. So we're able to see what kind of vegetables they were selling, what that would have looked like, the variety of things, and to know that these things came from the earth. These things came from the water and the air. It wasn't like they were brought from somewhere else. Folks knew what to do and how to do. And that kind of amateur botany and amateur zoology was a big part of the library of early African-American knowledge.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's an important point what you make is that, and again, it's something that we've been reinforcing through these episodes this month, is just the sheer inherent knowledge that the African community has in growing things in agriculture that they brought here. Like you pointed out, I mean, the the white people in general didn't have that kind of knowledge that the African Americans did, particularly because, again, the place that they were coming from, the environments that they were put into mirrored a lot of what they were for their generations of family came from. And so the irony of all of this is, once they do become freed people post Civil War and they try to own that land, the government kind of snubs them in favor of the white man who has much less knowledge, much less know-how, and they get the loans, they get the funding, and the USDA, if there's anything left, maybe gives it to the Black farmer, right? And that's how this kind of domino effect that we'll map out through the rest of this episode starts at that point, to go downhill, if you will.
Yeah, my I should say this to be dedicated to my late grandfather, who made it to 99 and almost 100. Well, yeah, 2 months shy of 100. Man. My grandfather, Gonzalo Twitty, was one of the founding members of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives.
Oh, wow. How about that?
Helped Black farmers stay in the land, and also participated in the suit against the United States government for discrimination.
Oh, he was part of that. Okay, so that was a landmark case.
We have a comment here too. I wanted to show it real quick, just so we have Brian Barsness wrote, I met a gentleman a few years ago from this organization, the blackfarmers.org. Not just produce all farmers. Be interesting to have someone, get someone from this group. So it looks like, even some of our listeners here too that are seeing this, these people are in the farming community. Obviously, Brian also said the learning of the history here is fire. So compliments already, Michael. You got a couple guys that are learning. You're dropping some knowledge on them already, man. So definitely always appreciate that. But two, before you start on the next topic too, Michael, like the history, like what you just explained, as you can tell, like John and I were just in awe listening to what you had to say. And, that's been a lot of this last month for us too, as we've been trying to connect, obviously, our passion for fresh produce and also the passion for Black History Month and African American people. Now we're learning this true backstory of a lot lot of this that we never knew, like, right? And it's we're like in produce, and we can tell everybody, oh, we've been here, we've been 3 generations in produce. So well, now we're learning a little bit of whys, how Chicago, the city in a garden, like how they got their produce, what they were known for, all the way down to, the soul food in Louisiana that they pretty much migrated up with, right? So tremendous job, man, already on just giving some knowledge. And John, obviously, moving through the episodes, we only have another 30 minutes or so. It's just think about all these little things with the history of fresh produce. And again, we talk about civilizations are lost from what, John? Crops, right? Water, sometimes like love, as we say. So it's interesting to see how they're built too, right, John?
Yeah. So I think moving along this, Michael, obviously I would assume that a big impetus for this big event, the Great Migration, if our listeners haven't heard of what that is or hadn't learned it in school, maybe you can touch on just very briefly what that is. But I assume that the impact from the government and their lack of funding to the Black farmers in the South had a contribution to that event.
Yes. So the Great Migration was, people give different numbers and names, but I have my own. 1870 to 1910 is the pre-Great Migration, and people went to Kansas. People went to Oklahoma. People went to the West Coast. They went, the Northeast Seaboard. It was a trickle, though. The flood comes between 1910 and 1940. And that's when World War I era, Woodrow Wilson presidency, he was horrible to us. And Birth of a Nation, the Red Summer, all these things. The Red Summer was when there were all these riots against Black communities as America is becoming industrial and modern. And so all of that is a huge impetus. There were also hurricanes in the rice growing part of the Carolinas and Georgia that basically destroyed the rice industry. That's very famous to a lot of people now. Based on African tradition and technology and know-how mixed with Western industrialism. Eventually, just remember that a lot of that rice that was processed prior to like 1840, 1850 was done by woven baskets and wooden mortars and pestles, the way it had been done in Africa for thousands of years. Beyond that, so you have 1910 to 1940. And then you have the really big event, 1940, 1970, spurred on by what you talked about before, lack of investment during the 20s and 30s, but also the boll weevil. The boll weevil went through southern cotton fields, and essentially destroyed the crop until it could be scientifically maintained. And so people took the advantage. I mean, a lot of times people don't know something. You weren't really free to move. A lot of times people who weren't living in cities, who were living in those rural counties in the Black Belt and other parts of the South, they had to leave in the middle of the night because they essentially made it illegal for them to have freedom of movement. My family went from Virginia to Boston to New York, Philadelphia, and sort of we sort of sometimes count Washington, D.C., sometimes we don't, because Washington, D.C. was surrounded by segregated territory. But the difference was it was one of the few border areas where you could actually get a federal job. Again, history is repeating itself with some certain issues. Cincinnati, Cleveland were also part of our thing. From Alabama, that was also Detroit. Pittsburgh was in there. That's Kentucky. That's Tennessee. That's Virginia. That's Alabama. That's Georgia. Chicago is Mississippi, predominantly, with some Louisiana and Tennessee and Missouri, and then the West Coast is definitely Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas.
Makes sense.
And you can probably think anything on the Mississippi River is going up or out. Anything along the eastern seaboard is going up. Anything in the central South is going to the central Midwestern states. So all of that. And that changes things, because my late mom, remembered, people coming up from the South in little trucks, selling food, selling produce. But you were also disconnected to the land. We went from being a 90%, watch this, in the time of the Civil War, a 90% rural people, to being an almost completely urban people by the time the Great Migration ended. And then, of course, there's the reverse migration after 1975 to Atlanta, to Charlotte, to other southern cities that had the promise of better work, and after the end of Jim Crow 1.0. So that's how that worked. Now we have young Black people who want to farm in northern cities. We have Black folks who are buying land together to reverse some of the ills of the past and say, okay, let's work together. Let's buy a farm. Let's buy land we can buy, build houses on. But of course, I think for me in my work, one of the worst parts of all this, even though we got our freedom and we advanced way beyond what we would have advanced had we just remained in that state, is this. Our diet, our health changed. You didn't hear about all these chronic illnesses and things in the same volume that you did when we became a urban, sedentary, industrial people. And if there's nothing else to show people the fact that food, lifestyle, culture, history, migration, violence can affect an entire people's trajectory, it would be this.
Yeah. And it's like you say, I mean, a lot of these people, well, as you painted, the reasons why everybody, well, a very high percentage of African Americans left the South, obviously with boll weevil, obviously cotton being what it is as a crop, very deteriorating to the land, which just caused more problems with harvests and yields. You have, like you say, you have this very rural people going into these urban centers. I mean, what impact did that have on agricultural knowledge, this rich knowledge that had been passed down generation to generation? Does that survive, or is there a level of loss there that is still felt today?
I think that's one of the things that people just never talk about. I was even watching the Skip Gates documentary on the Great Migration recently, and I'm just like, well, you can only do so much. People's attention span is only an hour to 4 hours now. People don't even talk about it. It's actually it's rough for me, because I did have the grandparents, the parents, and especially all my grandparents were born in the South, Virginia, Alabama, and South Carolina. When I say Virginia, I'm not talking about Virginia, like kind of like me, like, army or government facing Virginia. I'm talking about Farmville. They just named the dang-on town Farmville, and Prince Edward County, Virginia, where tobacco was king.
Wow.
Not so much anymore, but I mean, till when I was a teenager, flu cured and air cured tobacco, and fire cured and flu cured tobacco you could see it the minute you crossed into Amelia County from Richmond into Prince Edward into Appomattox, where my paternal grandmother's people were from. You saw this part of the past and part of our history that was just in your face. It was right there. You could smell it. You could see it. And that was both, majestic and terrifying for me, because, a lot of the generations that came out of slavery on my paternal grandmother's side did make their money in tobacco. What little they had. Well, they had land, and that was the important part. So to get what you're talking about, I think people need to understand something. Those crops, tobacco, cotton, rice, sugarcane, corn, wheat, whatever, they have their own systems. So part of what I did in the cooking gene was a shameless plug. It's still there. Go buy it. It's one of the few books where, an author of our heritage actually talks about the fact that it's not just the cash crop. The cash crop determines the cycle of everything else that you do in the year. When you hunt, when you fish, what you fish for, what you hunt for. You didn't just hunt every kind of animal every time of year. And your ability and your time to do that depended upon how much energy you were putting into the cash crop. I'll give you a quick example. With tobacco, back in the very, very, very the high period of Orinoco tobacco and sweet scented tobacco of the colonial period in the colonial tidewater, the tobacco hornworms were removed from the plants by the children, were bait for the fish that you would catch. Okay, you would grow things like gourds, things that did not require your heavy attention, because they would give you high rate of utility. That's where you are going to keep the tobacco hornworm or drink the water from the dipper gourd. You're going to make the prototypes for the banjo, the gourd fiddle, the gourd rattle, etc. You are going to use the chickens and guinea fowl and turkeys that you raise, those Dominican hens and pearl guineas and bronze turkeys are going to be pushed through the tobacco fields to also help get rid of certain pests. And the corn that's being raised versus the wheat. The wheat is called seldom, the corn is called common. When George Washington tries to shift the consumption from corn to wheat, the enslaved population got really angry. Number one, they didn't really know what to do with the wheat because they so seldom had flour. But also the chickens and the guineas and the turkeys that also went through the tobacco fields depended upon the corn. So you had a whole system of corn, wheat, tobacco, that tripartite agricultural system that, it was very specific. You knew when you had to do the hardest work in tobacco, the hardest work in corn, and the hardest work in wheat. And that affected everything else that you did. The persimmons that you would gather and make and ferment, would be made into a beverage to go into the field when people were working tobacco, which is like the July, August, even into early September. But when it's going to be really hot. I mean, there's a whole system there. Cotton is the same exact way. And so in interviewing my grandparents and also doing my work and going through these agricultural narratives, remember something. Southern agriculture was highly documented because it was a big business. But also what really makes me angry is that these guys, these wealthy Southern planters, whether they were in enslavement or not, are going on about their innovations, and most of them are not theirs. Yeah, they're correct. Not, you can look in the receipt books and cookbooks that other people are writing, because we weren't allowed to read and write during slavery. Yeah. The vast majority of us. They're writing these things, and you're going, oh, okay. This plant is cognate to a plant in West Africa. We're obviously knowing that community is growing, for example, elephant ear. You don't see certain plants like that. Elephant ear is a ornamental, but it's really the same thing as taro.
Yeah.
Right? They call cocoyam in West Africa. And you'll notice every time you go through these Black rural communities in the South, you'll notice that there's these ton of elephant ear plants, and it's always where there was a Black settlement.
Interesting.
And you look and you go, people are like, no, because it was food. It was there where the garden was.
Yeah.
And there were multiple gardens in those spaces, as I said before, according to what type of land you had. For example, sandy soil is good for one thing, sweet potatoes, peanuts, etc., versus hilly soil, which is good for another. And to understand all of those different pieces, you had, as my grandparents would say, you had to have somebody that wore the shoe. You get what I mean?
Makes sense. And speaking of like the African American agriculture traditions, right, that have been preserved, John and I have the question because we think that it's important to know, like, who the Gullah Geechee people are, right? The descended, from West African farmers, right? So, talk a little bit about that as well, Michael.
Cool. So, I'm a Gullah Geechee descendant, which means my people were, but they were sold off from. Okay. My good friend BJ Dennis was on High on the Hog with me and other programs talking about this heritage. But I think it's really important to understand something. Charleston represented 1/4 of all of the imported human beings during the slave trade to early and mid-century America.
Okay.
Then a lot of those people aren't staying; they're moving. They're being moved. The slave trade within America, the domestic slave trade, moved more human beings than were brought to North America during the trade. So the highest number we have is 500,000. And although some people go by strict census numbers, I think that genetically, based on my research, we have to go with 500,000.
Okay.
They're being brought from different places. Gullah Geechee people in particular were one group. A lot of Senegal and Gambia, the Rice Coast, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, Liberia, where the majority of West African rice was grown and had been grown for something like 5,000 years. Okay. Then, of course, we have people from other parts, southeastern Nigeria, southwestern Nigeria, what they are today, and of course, Congo, Angola. Huge. One third of all the people were from Congo, Angola. So the language, Gullah Geechee, the culture, the food, the traditions, the music, the form of religious worship. I would make another argument here that, another important population are the people of South Louisiana and the lower Mississippi Valley. Very similar in terms of having their own language, the food, impact on the food, agriculture, growing things, hunting, fishing. It's interesting that, you go to the museum, they talk about who's Cajun. And I have a lot of friends who are from Nova Scotia or live in Nova Scotia and Quebec, and they're just like, yeah, they're also in the French Canadian diaspora family, but they ain't like us. It's a whole other group of people. But it's impactful because who do you think they learn how to grow rice and hot peppers and the gardens with mirliton or chayote or eggplant from? It wasn't, these things didn't come from France. They didn't come from Canada. So obviously there was a lot of cultural mixing and exchanging going on. But I guess the bigger point is that there are these pockets, okay, of people. And what's really powerful is I was reading Frederick Douglass many years ago. And he says it's a very tantalizing, very brief paragraph that the language of the people in his part of the Eastern Shore of Maryland was, he didn't say Gullah Geechee, but it was the same patois. And so you have to assume that Gullah Geechee corridor between southeastern North Carolina, northern Florida, with its heart in South Carolina and Georgia, this is less of a exotic sort of like pocket. That is a saving remnant of a culture that was probably much wider. So Douglass says that, where did you get that peach? We didn't get them peachy. And anybody from Sierra Leone who speaks Creole, anybody who speaks Gullah Geechee could understand that phrase grammatically and understand how it was being said and it's pronounced. And he goes on a little bit, but it's like if I had any question to ask Frederick Douglass, it would be, what did you grow in those gardens? It was very little about that in there. But also, how did people survive day to day? But also, what about this language? And he said that this was the way people spoke up to when he ran away. So we're talking 1830s, 1840s, when you were listening to the average seaboard African American who lived in these isolated farms and plantations. It's the same language with different dialects.
Yeah.
So, but I will, okay, one more part about Gullah Geechee community. Extremely important in terms of being watermen, in terms of truck farming. And there was the most beautiful description from Charles Calcock Jones. And he says, he talked about how the gardens of the Black people of the Low Country were grown, and I quote, in commingled luxuriance. And he mentions elephant ear and sesame and sugarcane and rice and arrowroot and all these things. And not one of them sounds like anything that's just a common whatever. These are tropical, African Atlantic, West African mangrove crops. These are not things that you would find just anywhere. but he used the phrase commingled luxuriance. What does that mean? It means that everything was grown in companion planting. And if you notice, what I noticed was when people would describe Black gardens, whether it was 1700s or 1600s or whatever, the way that they're describing them is the way they're seeing them, and there are certain crops and plants being grown together. So, for example, Semling, which you all may call patty pan squash, which was bigger than it is now, with sweet potato and other things, I grew them and cowpeas, I grew them together, and guess what? Mass abundance. Well, really productive. And that's because they understood certain plants help each other, certain plants harm each other, but also by growing them together, you cut down how much water you have to do, you cut down infestation, and you provide ground cover so that weeds can't flourish.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of knowledge that we've lost that my work is there to try to regain.
Yeah, I think that's the amazing thing with a case study like Gullah Geechee, this community and people that have preserved these traditions, that this knowledge that continues to this day. Like you say, they're still growing those traditional crops, whether it be okra or rice or the elephant ears, like you said. And it's just, they're really an exhibit of culture and agricultural ecosystems just being completely linked. They don't exist without each other. They need each other. And so that's a great example of the preservation and the resilience, again, a common thing that we've been seeing through these episodes during Black History Month of the African American community, that they evolve, and while they evolve, they still hold on to their values and their ancestral knowledge and traditions. Now,
and John, we've also learned too, it's about the people, right? It's
right.
each family has passed down something from generations to generations, and Michael, this, it's up to you to preserve it, right? It's up to you to have the passion to move forward and represent, your family and your culture. And we've seen that through a lot of the people that we have interviewed, right, John, and even some of the history that we've researched on, and it is amazing. And then again, that almost, as we in the last few minutes of this too, I mean, I want to know a little bit about today too, John. I mean, what do you think? I mean, what do you want to kind of steer this to?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have again, we could talk hours about this.
Oh my gosh, like seriously.
So we're only scraping the surface here. So we have a basic knowledge based on this conversation we've been having, Michael, about why we're seeing less African American farmers on a commercial scale today.
Correct.
They're there. And I think a really great example of that, maybe you can touch on that briefly, is how urban farming has become a form of resistance to preserving the African American agricultural knowledge and tradition by reclaiming these spaces in these cities and developing these communities, again, all around agriculture and moving that tradition forward.
Yeah.
The consequence of having food deserts, the consequence of having lack of access, the consequence of all of this has been that younger people from the past, not just now, I mean, it's a Gen X through Gen Z thing, and soon to be Alpha thing, where people have been brought back to simplicity, brought back to nature, brought back to progress by growing things on their own. I remember many years ago when I saw an article about folks in Philly growing, the article, the way it started was very weird. It was talking about, some black men in some overalls going to tend some whatever. But it was like, well, we're trying to, share these traditions with our children and grandchildren. We miss the land. Nobody missed being exploited. But essentially, a large part of your manhood and womanhood was in your productivity and your ability, as we always said, to create something out of nothing. And now that's become, and Lewis talked about that too, how thrilled she was about by the time I was born, actually. People returning to the land and farming and doing other things. So I said that this is happening everywhere. The big problem is access to land. So, for example, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. in Washington, D.C., the issue is the federal government owns most of the land, empty open space. So having private land is very expensive. So it's hard. It's not easy to do these projects. Now, no one gives you anything, and you have to take the bare scrapings and make a project work. But they're working. I mean, it's hard, but they're working, and they're working because they understand. They're not happy with every time you look up, there's a new warning about a food from a field in Bakersfield or something, or the fact that the food takes so long to get there. I remember going into one of the stores is very popular in Baltimore, and it was amazing to see how one half lived. Well, not one half, but one part of the community in Baltimore lived and the other lived. I remember going to the farmers market and going to seeing the uplift of Black farmers like my friend Denzel Mitchell and other people growing things like the fish pepper, which I felt popularized, which is an African American heirloom from old Maryland. And then you go to the tawny side of the Baltimore metro area, and people are going to Whole Foods and other places. But then you go to East Baltimore, and then there's a store. And I remember, y'all, I saw one type of grapes. I saw one, and obviously it came from far, far away on a truck, and all of them weren't great. And one iceberg lettuce was the only lettuce you could get. And there was, if you wanted a cold cut, it was bologna, and you wanted cheese, it was American cheese issued by the government. It was just, and then there was all this frozen food and food with dyes. And I didn't, I had been so far removed from the corner store world. I didn't understand how bad this is, and everybody's doing their shopping there. It's like no one is getting those tastes or traditions or fresh food the way they did once upon a time. Even when we were oppressed more heavily, we still made a way out of no way. And so that's why people are investing so much time and energy in these projects, because what's the alternative? We can't sit around and wait to die. We can't sit around and wait to be made more sick by lack of access. That's only one part of it. The other part of it is that we're losing the recipes. We're losing the traditional foods that are just as gourmet as anybody else's. And we need to own them. We have to eat them. We have to make them. We have to create the cultural permission structures to be able to get that access to the ingredients that we need and practice those traditions on our own terms.
Yeah, Michael, and one thing we obviously want to support is to see the growth of African American farmers. We talk about a lot of them all the time and who they are. It's like we can recognize them. So as we want to support them more and more, what could we do as the ag community, right? What could we do as your fellow farmer to say, hey, how can we support African American farmers, and how can we see more to want to grow in this industry, right? I even told stories on some of the other episodes. If you've tuned in and listening to our guests, like we talked about some of these people that literally just like, I'm getting out of corporate, I'm getting out of here. We're going to be broccoli growers in Florida, and that we featured on, in 2020. And then we've got certain like NFL players that have gotten out of the NFL, retired to farming, right? And because that's where they grew up, on a farm, and they just got out of it, right? But it came back as a passion, as a love. So what can we do as a community to support that and help bring more forward?
Well, I mean, you got Soul Fire Farm in New York. You got Peculiar Pig Farm in South Carolina. You have all the stuff that's going in Detroit. Malik Yakini, and oh man, you have all these people who are just really having grocery. Malik's doing grocery stores now, not just the farms that are supported. There's so many. I mean, do the work. Work your Google. Find the people who are doing this. And, I try to post about these different projects all the time. There's a Oko Farms in New York City, run by a young African woman who has, has all the different ethnic communities in New York. And it's a Black-owned, agricultural project. She's doing aquaculture and raising these, vegetables from home in New York, and providing people with space to support community support agriculture. So I mean, just keep follow, look at people on Instagram, look at people on other social media platforms, and ask questions about where you can go to your local community to also support efforts like these. But you can also support this work by knowing who to follow. Give me a follow on Instagram, and Threads. I'm the Cooking Gene on Threads and Instagram. Trying to do this work, and of course, the Cooking Gene, the book, is important too. It's important to understand that there are not that many people, and I don't like that. There are not that many people who are actually able to put out the research of the work that defines, not just the traditions, but how they all fit together. There's not that many of us out here. I am
100%.
historical interpreter and an heirloom gardener and a 2-bit micro farmer and all these different parts. And there's not 20 of us. There's not 10 of us. There's probably less than that. And it's an incredible burden in some ways to be from day to day go, okay, well, I'm the saving remnant. I care about what happened in terms of our farming and our traditions and our hunting and our fishing and the whole system going back several hundred years. I've been to West Africa 8 times.
Wow.
I hope to go back so I can go to Angola and the safer part of Congo so I can learn some more and go back to live, for a few months at a time so I can really experience some of the traditions. I have my citizenship in Sierra Leone. So, been in Nigeria, Cameroon, all of that, Gambia, been to where Alex Haley's ancestor, Kunta Kinte, was born. But every time, we should leave this with this little story. When I was in Sierra Leone, I was in a Mandinka village, and I got my name and everything, and I am part Mandinka. And when I told the chief, the head man of the village, about my father and my grandfather teaching me how to grow things and raise animals, etc. And I was going through, and they were so excited. The kids are so excited. The elders are so excited. As we're going through the village, and I'm just like, oh, and I'm saying things in Mandinka like, so, Kanjo, and they're like, what? How do you know that? And I'm like, yeah, so, black eyed peas, Kanjo is okra. And the chief he was a very stately man, and he said to me, "Oh, how do you know all this? What did you do?" I said, "My father grew, my mother grew, my grandfather, my grandmother." And he goes and he says in Mandinka, he grabs me like kind of like a half hug, and he puts his hands on my shoulders and he goes, "They taught you farming?" He says in Mandinka, "God is great."
Yeah. Amazing.
Very powerful. He's like, he's acknowledging that this, he's like telling me, I'm so glad, in English, I'm so glad that your people did not let it die with you.
That is a perfect story to finish with, for sure. I mean, and like you said, look, it just shows you how alive this connection still remains today to the people in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, how important it is. Like you said, Michael, I mean, you're one of very few people that kind of pieced the whole story together. And we're very honored to have had you here to tell that story, even if it's very brief. We're very honored to be able to share it. Again, I wish we had a lot more time because there's so many more things I want to talk to you. So if you're up for it, for sure, we'd love to have you back sometime down the road, and we can definitely get into more of the nitty gritty on some of these things. So
I agree.
It's such an important story, such an important piece of history that we need to preserve and have grow back up into the knowledge of everyday people, especially in America. So,
gentlemen, if I had if in my wildest dreams, one of my things is if the average American could see what it would be like to walk into a marketplace or a store and see all of these viable, beautiful types of tomatoes and peppers and okra and all these other things, they would be bewildered. Because right here in this soil, from indigenous times through today, through immigrant communities, we have such an explosive cornucopia. You know, I hope that you all, I hope that you all have done or will do a podcast about the Vietnamese people in New Orleans who grow things in the canals.
Ooh. I will make a note of that one.
Cool one.
Make a note. Okay, cool. I'd love to come back.
I love it. I love it. Well, Michael,
thank
you so much. We appreciate all your time. Everyone, we're going to have his all of his information in the description too of the podcast. So that way you'll be able to follow him on Instagram, Threads, and even check out all of his content. And again, we want to buy his book. If you want to support, I always say local African-American writers. He's got awards. We love it. Look at him. We got to smile like 4 or 5 times. We got him, and we know he's having a good time. So, Michael, again, thank you so much for joining the history of fresh produce today.
Thank you.
Thank you.